For 141 years, it was against the law in Britain to make a cheap bar of soap. Inside every soap works, an excise officer had a set of keys, and every night he used them. He locked the boiling pan shut, sealed them so the owner couldn't sneak in one extra batch after dark. Parliament had turned washing into a crime scene, and it kept the locks on for 141 years. That's longer than the reigns of Victoria, Edward VII and George V combined. And the thing being rationed by law wasn't gold or grain. It was a bar of soap. That was still the reality in 1837, the year an 18-year-old girl became queen of the largest empire on earth. But the story of how Britain made cleanliness a luxury, then spent decades convincing everyone that being unwashed was a moral failure, starts well before she took the throne, and it doesn't finish until the century is nearly out. When Victoria was crowned, the soap tax was already 125 years old. It had been law since 1712, brought in under Queen Anne to help pay for a war, and nobody now living could remember a Britain without it. It wasn't a small tax either. It roughly tripled the price of even the coarsest, cheapest soap you could buy. Imagine a bar of supermarket soap that costs £3 today costing £9 forever by government decree, for no reason except that the Treasury liked the money. That's the arithmetic Victorian households were doing every time they thought about washing. The tax didn't just sit quietly in the price, it reached inside the factories themselves. Soap makers worked under direct excise supervision, officers stationed on the premises, watching every batch go into the pan and every bar come out. This wasn't a tax collected afterwards, on a finished product sitting in a shop. It was a tax enforced at the point of manufacture, with a government official standing over the vat. The state didn't just want its cut. It wanted to watch you make the soap, to make certain you couldn't make more of it than you declared. So what did people do, faced with soap they mostly couldn't afford? Some of them went around the law entirely. Through the early Victorian decades, a black market in smuggled and illicitly made soap ran alongside the legal trade, the same way it ran alongside heavily taxed tea, salt, and spirits. Soap wasn't glamorous contraband, but it was contraband all the same, moved quietly to avoid a duty that had made the honest version unaffordable for half the country. Others simply left. Some manufacturers shifted their production out of England altogether to Ireland and elsewhere, chasing a lower or non-existent duty just to stay in business. Think about what that means. A tax on cleanliness was punishing enough that it was cheaper to relocate a factory than to keep paying it. Britain's own soap industry was being pushed offshore by its own government at the exact moment industrial Britain was supposed to be leading the world in manufacturing. By the 1830s and 1840s, the manufacturers who stayed had had enough. The Association of London and Country Soap Manufacturers began lobbying Parliament directly, arguing that the duty was strangling their trade and keeping the poor filthy while it did it. This wasn't a fringe complaint, it was organised industry pressure, sustained across 2 decades, aimed squarely at getting the tax off the books, and for a long time it went nowhere. This is where the story takes its first real turn, because Parliament's answer wasn't to cut the tax, it was to build round it. In 1846, the government passed the Baths and Washhouses Act, letting local corporations and parishes fund public baths and washhouses out of the rates. Read that carefully. The state had made soap so expensive that ordinary people couldn't get properly clean at home, and its solution was to build public infrastructure to compensate, while leaving the tax that caused the problem fully in place. It's a government patching a hole it dug itself, and charging local ratepayers for the plaster. Where those baths opened, the demand was immediate and overwhelming. Coventry opened its new public baths in 1852, and on the very first day, upwards of 1,000 people queued to bathe. Picture that. A single town, a single day, and 1,000 people lining up for the chance to get properly washed, because the market for cheap soap had been strangled for a century and a half, and this was the first crack of daylight. That queue is the whole story in miniature. The demand for cleanliness had never gone away. It had just been priced out of reach. While all this was happening, Britain's soap industry was already enormous, tax and all. National production in 1850 ran to roughly 157,254,000 pounds of soap. In Plymouth alone, one set of works, the Coxside Soap Factory run by Bryant, Burnell and Company, turned out more than £4 million of hard soap in a single year, 1848, before it burned to the ground in October 1850. This is not a cottage industry limping along under an unfair tax. This is heavy industrial output at scale, while still shackled by a duty that made the retail price absurd. It tells you exactly how much bigger this trade was about to get the moment that shackle came off, and the gap in who actually got to use all that soap was stark. Contemporary estimates put agricultural labourers at around £4 of soap a year per head. Workmen in better trades might use up to £12. Wealthy families used as much as £30 a year. Do the comparison plainly. The richest Victorians were using roughly 7 times more soap than a farm labourer. 7 times. That's not a taste difference. That's a law dressed up as a market deciding who got to be clean. This is where most people assume the story simply resolves, that someone in power saw the numbers and fixed it. It's more specific than that, and it has a name attached. In 1853, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Ewart Gladstone, abolished the soap excise duty in his budget. 141 years after it began. 141 years. Say it again. 141 years of locked pans and tripled prices, ended by a single budget statement in the House of Commons. It hadn't survived that long by accident. The duty was bringing the Treasury around £800,000 a year, and that revenue, not any love of dirt, is the real reason decades of manufacturer lobbying had gone nowhere. Governments rarely give up £800,000 a year out of sentiment. Gladstone's repeal sat inside a wider mid-century clear-out of taxes on ordinary life. The window tax had already gone in 1851. Newspaper stamp duty would follow in 1855, paper duty in 1861. But soap had outlasted all the other everyday life taxes on that list. It was the stubborn one, the one the Treasury clung to longest before finally letting go. With the duty gone, soap became markedly cheaper to make and sell, and the industry that had been producing tens of millions of pounds of product a year even under the old tax was suddenly free to expand into a market that had been waiting, visibly, in a queue outside a Coventry bathhouse. The locked pans stayed locked no longer. For the first time in the memory of anyone alive, getting clean in Britain was no longer something the government had deliberately priced out of reach. With no tax left to blame, you'd expect Britain simply to get on with washing itself, cheaply and quietly, and be done with it. That isn't what happened. What happened next didn't come from a factory or a parliament. It came from a soap company, and one man decided that if the government could no longer keep people from being clean, he could make them terrified of being anything else. That man was Thomas James Barratt. He joined his father-in-law's firm, A&F Pears, in the mid-1860s, starting out as little more than a clerk and a bookkeeper before working his way up to become the firm's chairman. On paper, that sounds like an unremarkable career in trade. It wasn't. Guinness World Records credits Barratt as the world's first brand manager, and he's widely called, informally but persistently, the father of modern advertising. Pears already had one real asset behind it. Back in 1851, the firm had won a prize medal for its soap at the Great Exhibition, the great showcase of British industry held in the Crystal Palace. For years, that medal sat quietly on the label. Barratt was about to make it work far harder than any medal had ever worked before. This is where the story stops being about a government pricing washing out of reach and starts being about something colder. A private company deciding that cleanliness itself could be turned into a product you were frightened not to buy. Barratt didn't sell soap by describing what it did. He sold it by attaching it to faces the public already trusted, and then broadcasting that trust as loudly as money could buy. His first great coup was religious. To crack open the American market, Barratt engineered a meeting with the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, one of the most famous and most trusted preachers in the United States, a Congregationalist minister with genuine national influence. Barratt gatecrashed a reception at Beecher's own home to get to him, and he came away with an endorsement no soap company had any right to expect. Beecher put his name to a line that Barratt then printed everywhere. If cleanliness is next to godliness, soap must be considered a means of grace, and a clergyman who recommends moral things should be willing to recommend soap. Beecher didn't stop there either. He said Pears's commendation had opened up a large sale for the company in America, and that he was willing to stand by every word he'd ever said in its favor. Barratt didn't just print that quote in a magazine and move on. He bought the entire front page of the New York Herald to run it. The whole page. Not a corner, not a column. The complete front sheet of a major American newspaper turned over to announce that a famous man of God now personally vouched for a bar of soap. Think about what that transaction actually was. A minister's spiritual authority, rented out and printed at newspaper scale to move units. Religion had been folded into a sales pitch, and nobody in 1880s America had built up any immunity to that trick yet, because nobody had tried it on this scale before. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Barratt had just shown that a company could buy the borrowed authority of any admired public figure, attach it to a product, and multiply it through the sheer scale of print. He wasn't finished testing how far that idea could stretch. In 1882, he turned to Lily Langtry, the English actress and socialite whose face was already one of the most recognized in the country, a woman celebrated for her beauty and her connections in the highest social circles. Barratt signed her to endorse Pears soap, and the arrangement is now widely cited as the first celebrity endorsement of a commercial product in history. Not the first use of a famous face. In an advertisement, in some loose sense, the first documented instance of the exact mechanism that still drives billions of pounds of marketing today. A company paying a person the public already adores to say, implicitly, that using this product is what people like her do. Langtry's face didn't describe the soap's ingredients or its price. It described a kind of person you could become by buying it. By the early 1880s, Barratt had assembled two of the three pillars of his method, a trusted religious authority and a celebrated public beauty, each rented out to make an ordinary bar of soap feel like a passport into moral respectability or high society. He had one more move left, and it was the boldest of the three, because this time the target wasn't a preacher or an actress. It was a painting, hanging in the home of one of the most respected artists in the entire country. That artist was John Everett Millais, co-founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and one of the most celebrated painters in Britain. He'd painted a small portrait of his own 5-year-old grandson, William Milburn James, blowing bubbles through a clay pipe, lost entirely in the moment. He called it a child's world. It was tender, quiet, and completely innocent of any commercial intention. Sir William Ingram, owner of the Illustrated London News, bought the picture first and reproduced it. Then Barratt came for it. In 1886, Barratt bought the painting from Ingram for £2,200, a genuine fortune for a single image, and secured exclusive copyright over it in the process. That copyright was the whole point. It meant Barratt now owned the right to reproduce that tender private image of a child anywhere he liked, for any purpose he liked. He renamed it Bubbles, and he had a bar of Pears soap painted into the corner of the reproduction, glued into the scene like it had always belonged there. Millais was uneasy at first, watching his grandson's quiet portrait turned into shop window advertising. But once he saw the finished mock-ups, he came round to it, and the image went out everywhere, on hoardings, in magazines, on trade cards handed across shop counters. A masterpiece by one of the nation's most respected painters was now, unmistakably, an advert for soap. Not everyone came round to it. The novelist Marie Corelli, one of the best-selling authors of the entire era, attacked Millais publicly in print, in her novel The Sorrows of Satan, accusing him of prostituting his talent to sell soap. It was a serious, wounding public charge, aimed at a man whose reputation had been built on serious art. Millais pointed out, reasonably enough, that he'd sold the copyright outright and had no legal power left to stop what Barratt did with it. Corelli eventually retracted the attack, but for a while the accusation stood in print, unanswered, and the argument it represented was bigger than one painter's discomfort. This is where cleanliness and art collapsed into the same object, in front of the entire country, and polite society did not know what to make of it. A painting could no longer be trusted to simply be a painting. It might, at any moment, turn out to be a soap advertisement, with a famous name attached, and nobody had agreed on whether that was a scandal or simply how the modern world was going to work from now on. Barratt wasn't the only one selling purity to Victorian Britain in these years. And he didn't have the only successful formula. In 1885, William Hesketh Lever and his brother James Darcy Lever founded Lever Brothers and launched a product called Sunlight Soap. Where Pears leaned on borrowed faces and borrowed art, Sunlight leaned on the product itself. It was made from vegetable oils rather than animal tallow, using a process developed by the chemist William Hoof Watson, and it came pre-cut and pre-packaged into neat 1-pound bars, a genuine novelty at the time, when most soap was still sold as a rough, unwrapped lump cut to size at the counter. Lever marketed it hard under a single promise, a guarantee of purity. Within 3 years, Sunlight was the best-selling soap in the whole of Britain. That success built something you can still visit today. Lever used the fortune Sunlight generated to construct an entire model village for his workers, starting in 1888 on the Wirral, complete with proper housing, gardens, schools, and public buildings, all built to a standard most industrial workers of the era could never have dreamed of. He called it Port Sunlight, after the soap that paid for every brick of it, a single household product freed from a tax that had throttled it for a century and a half, had generated enough wealth in 3 years to raise a town from nothing. 2 companies, 2 different routes to the same conclusion. Pears sold purity through borrowed faces. A preacher, an actress, a painter's grandson. Sunlight sold purity through the product itself, through vegetable oil and a guarantee printed on the wrapper. Both were selling exactly the same idea to exactly the same public. That cleanliness was no longer simply something you did. It was something you had to prove, and something you now had to purchase the right materials to prove it with. If you're finding this interesting, take a moment to hit subscribe. We dig up buried corners of Victorian history like this every week, and there's plenty more strange, uncomfortable stories coming. Now, back to the story of soap, because underneath the marketing triumphs there's a harder reckoning to make, and it starts with a question nobody in the advertisements was asking. Who actually paid the price for those 141 years of locked pans and tripled costs, and who never stopped paying it, even after the law changed? The answer is the same people it always is. Agricultural labourers in the urban poor lived, worked and slept in bodies and clothes that stayed dirtier for 141 straight years, not because Britain lacked soap makers, or soap ingredients, or soap demand. All 3 existed in abundance the entire time. The only thing missing was permission to sell it to them cheaply. The Treasury collected roughly £800,000 a year from that duty, year after year, decade after decade, and every pound of it was money that had come, indirectly, out of the washing water of people who could least afford the markup. Remember that gap in who got to be clean. Wealthy households used up to £30 of soap a year. A farm labourer used around 4. 7 times more soap, funneled to the people who already had the most of everything else. Cleanliness in Victorian Britain wasn't a mark of virtue. It was a mark of income, enforced for a century and a half by an Act of Parliament, and everyone at the time simply learned to read it as character instead. And that's exactly what happened. As the century wore on, Victorian moralists increasingly treated the poor's dirtiness not as the predictable result of a punishing tax, but as a personal failing, even a spiritual one. The phrase that captured it was already circulating before Victoria even took the throne. The Great Unwashed, coined in 1830 in Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel Paul Clifford. It had started as a satirical jab aimed at hypocritical upper-class prejudice. Across the Victorian decades, it curdled into something much simpler, straightforward contempt for the poor, delivered in a phrase polite society used without a second thought. The clock was already ticking on that contempt, and the people wearing it as an insult couldn't hear it yet. The state had built the dirt gap with a tax. Society then turned around and blamed the dirty for it, as if a farm labourer earning perhaps 9 or 10 pence a day had simply chosen to smell of the sty and the field, rather than having been priced out of the one thing that might have washed it off him. This is where the story does something genuinely strange, because the tax died in 1853, and you'd expect the injustice to have died with it. It didn't. It changed hands. The instinct that had driven the whole first half of this story, profiting from other people's bodies and other people's shame, didn't disappear when Gladstone's budget abolished the soap duty. It simply moved out of the Treasury and into the advertising department. Barratt and men like him took the exact anxiety the tax had created, the fear of being seen as unwashed and therefore lesser, and instead of relieving it, they monetized it all over again. That's the real twist sitting underneath everything Barratt built with Beecher, with Langtry, with Millais' stolen bubble. None of those advertisements were really about soap's ingredients or its price. They were reframing cleanliness all over again as a test you could fail in public. First, the government had rationed washing by income and let a moral judgment grow up around the shortage it created. Then the private sector picked up that exact moral judgment, polished it, and sold it back to the public as motivation to buy. A preacher's blessing, an actress's face, and a dead painter's grandson were all deployed for precisely the same purpose the tax had once served without meaning to, making ordinary people feel that their worth was legible on their skin and that someone else got to grade it. Nothing in law stopped Barratt doing any of this. There was no advertising regulation in Victorian Britain at all, nothing resembling it. A soap company could buy a clergyman's endorsement, purchase a masterpiece's copyright, or run a national newspaper's entire front page, and no authority anywhere would so much as raise an eyebrow. The tax had been law, rigid, and enforced with officers and locks. The advertising that replaced it was entirely unregulated, and in some ways that made it more powerful, not less. Nobody was watching this door at all. That absence of any rulebook meant the playbook Barratt had built kept expanding, right through to the century's close. By the 1890s, Pears had settled into a single relentless slogan, repeated across posters, magazines, and hoardings until it became almost a national catchphrase. Good morning, have you used Pears' soap? It wasn't a description of the product. It was a question aimed directly at the reader, phrased so that answering no felt like admitting something shameful about yourself before you'd even finished your tea. That's the mechanism laid bare. The advert wasn't selling glycerin and scent. It was selling the discomfort of being asked in public whether you measured up. Pears also leaned hard on its scientific credentials wherever it could borrow them. The firm advertised endorsements from medical men and chemists, alongside the clergyman and the actress, stacking expert testimonial on top of celebrity glamour on top of fine art, until a single soap wrapper carried the accumulated authority of a preacher, a beauty, a painter, and a doctor, all pointing the same direction. Layer enough borrowed trust onto one small bar of soap, and it stops looking like a household product at all. It starts looking like a verdict on the person using it. Sunlight ran its own version of the same campaign in parallel, though its accent fell differently. Where Pears sold moral character, Lever Brothers sold industrial trust, the guarantee of purity printed boldly on every wrapped bar, an explicit promise that what was inside had been made honestly, from vegetable oil, under a named process, not adulterated or stretched the way cheaper soaps sometimes were. It's worth sitting with how strange that guarantee actually was. For 141 years, the government itself had stood inside soap factories with keys and locks, supervising manufacture down to the pan. The moment that state supervision vanished, a private company immediately stepped into the gap it left, offering its own guarantee instead, because the public had learned correctly that soap making was worth watching closely. Nobody trusted the market to police itself without being told to, so the advertisement did the reassuring that the excise officer used to do and charged for the privilege. Picture the two campaigns running at once in the same decade, competing for the same shelf. A wall poster showing a rosy-cheeked child chasing bubbles, a bar of Pears glowing beside him like a small treasure. A few streets over, a hoarding for sunlight, blunt and industrial, promising purity through chemistry rather than sentiment. Two different companies, two entirely different tones, selling precisely the same underlying claim. That cleanliness was now a thing you proved by choosing correctly, not simply a thing you did. And this consumer choice was happening inside households that were themselves changing shape through the last third of the century. A private bathroom, once the preserve of the genuinely wealthy, was becoming a realistic ambition for a much wider slice of the middle classes by the 1880s and 1890s. A small room with running water and a proper tub, where a bar of scented, translucent soap, like Pears' own glycerin bar, could sit on the edge as a quiet daily marker of refinement. Pears made a point of its clarity and its light, garden-like scent, precisely because those qualities photographed and printed well, and precisely because they signaled something the coarse yellow soap of a labourer's cottage never could. You could see the difference between the two bars at a glance, and Victorian Britain had trained itself over 60 years to read that glance as a judgment on the person holding it. Meanwhile, for households nowhere near affording a private bathroom, the public baths that had first opened their doors under that 1846 Act had multiplied steadily across the country. By 1865, numerous large towns had built their own baths and washhouses, tiered by price so that a family could choose a cheaper plunge pool or a costlier private cubicle, laundry facilities usually running alongside so that clothes and bodies could be washed on the same visit. Queues, steam, the noise of dozens of people at once, all a world away from the private, silent ritual. The advertisements were now selling to the middle classes. Two Britons washing in parallel, one queuing at a municipal bathhouse built to patch a law's damage, the other buying a wrapped bar stamped with a preacher's blessing, and both of them, by the 1890s, engaged in the same basic act that had been effectively criminalized at scale only 40 years before. It's worth pausing on how fast that whole reversal actually happened, because the speed of it is its own kind of shock. A person born in the year the soap tax was finally repealed, 1853, would have grown up in a Britain where cheap soap was brand new, still a novelty their grandparents had never known in their own working lives. By the time that same person reached their 30s or 40s, in the 1880s and 1890s, they were living through an entirely different problem. Not a shortage of soap, but a ceaseless barrage of imagery insisting they weren't washing correctly, or often enough, or with the right brand, to be considered respectable at all. Within a single working lifetime, Britain went from a country where the government made soap scarce on purpose, to a country where private companies made cleanliness feel perpetually insufficient on purpose. Neither version left an ordinary person feeling simply adequately clean. That same decade sitting quietly inside this story is worth naming properly because it shaped the wider climate soap was selling into. In the summer of 1858, the heat over London grew so severe that the Thames itself turned into an open sewer, carrying the waste of 3 million people past the very windows of Parliament. Members soaked the curtains of the Commons in chloride of lime just to keep sitting through their own debates, and the stench became so unbearable that funding for a completely new sewer system was rushed through within 18 days. They called it the Great Stink, and it happened only 5 years after the soap tax fell. Dr. John Snow had already correctly traced earlier cholera outbreaks in 1848 and in 1854, back to contaminated water rather than bad air, though most people at the time still blamed miasma, a poisonous atmosphere they imagined rising off filth itself. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette's new sewer network followed directly from that emergency. None of this was about soap, but it tells you what kind of decade soap's sudden affordability landed inside. A Britain newly and viscerally obsessed with dirt as a public danger, not merely a private embarrassment, primed and ready to receive exactly the message Barratt was about to sell it. If you're enjoying this one, now's a good time to subscribe, because there's a lot more hidden Victorian history like this coming, and you won't want to miss it. Back to the story. Set against that backdrop, the soap advertisements of the 1880s and 1890s weren't simply competing with each other for market share. They were feeding directly off a public mood that had already been taught by a real and terrifying sanitary crisis to treat dirt as something close to a moral and physical emergency. Barratt didn't invent the association between filth and danger. He inherited it, fully formed, from a decade of cholera maps and stinking rivers, and then quietly redirected it. The enemy stopped being contaminated water in the street outside. It became whatever was or wasn't on your own washstand that morning. That redirection is the real engine of everything Barratt built, and it's worth being precise about the mechanism, because it's not simply that he made soap seem attractive. Plenty of products manage that without doing any lasting damage. What Barratt did was subtly different and far more durable. He took a genuine public health fear, one that had killed people in their thousands during the cholera years, and he narrowed it down until it pointed at an individual's private habits rather than at contaminated water supplies or overcrowded slums. If you were unwashed in Barratt's world, the danger wasn't a shared civic failure of drains and water boards. It was a personal, moral lapse, entirely yours to fix, for for the price of 1 bar of soap? That's a much more profitable fear than a public one, because a public danger gets solved once, by an engineer like Bazalgette, and then it's over. A personal, moral one never gets solved. It only gets soothed, bar after bar, forever. That soothing sold bar by bar still cost money, and money was exactly what hadn't been fixed by Gladstone's repeal. A labourer's household in the later Victorian decades might set aside something like 6pence a week for soap, starch, blue and soda combined. The ordinary run of washing materials that kept a family's clothes and linen presentable. 6pence doesn't sound like much until you set it against what that same household was earning. An agricultural labourer in several regions was still bringing home something in the region of 9 to 12 pence a day through the middle decades of the century. Set 6pence a week for washing materials against that, and you're looking at a genuine, recurring bite out of a family budget that had almost nothing to spare in the first place. The tax was gone. The squeeze on a poor household's shillings was not. That's the detail the advertisements never mentioned, because it cut directly against their message. Barratt's whole campaign assumed a viewer with the spare income to choose the right soap, the fragrant, translucent, scientifically endorsed bar over the coarse, cheap alternative. But choice requires money, and a great many of the households being quietly shamed by those posters simply didn't have it to spend. So the same 7-to-1 gap that had defined the taxed era, wealthy families using up to £30 of soap a year against a labourer's 4, didn't close the moment the duty disappeared. It simply changed its justification. Under the tax, the poor stayed dirtier because the law made soap expensive for everyone, and they had least to spare. After the tax, the poor stayed dirtier because the market now offered a hierarchy of soaps, and the cheapest end of that hierarchy was still, unmistakably, coarser, harsher, and less pleasant than what the wealthy used, while the advertisements pretended the only thing separating clean from unclean was correct choice, not income at all. Sit with what that means for a single household living through it. A labourer's wife in the 1880s, doing the family wash in a shared tub of reused water, often cold, using whatever coarse bar she could afford that week, would have seen the same Pears posters everyone else saw, the same rosy child chasing bubbles, the same solemn line about godliness and grace. She wasn't being told that soap existed, and she should try it. She already knew soap existed. She was being told, implicitly, in poster after poster, that the soap she could actually afford wasn't the real thing, that proper cleanliness lived one rung up the price ladder from wherever her own budget stopped. The advertisement wasn't selling her a solution, it was selling her a small, repeated reminder of a gap she had no way to close. That's the sharper, quieter version of the twist sitting underneath Barratt's whole career. It's easy to tell the story of Pears and Sunlight as a triumph, cheap soap finally reaching a grateful nation after a century and a half of government-enforced scarcity, and, in the broadest sense, that's true. Average consumption did rise. Bathrooms did spread further down the social scale than they ever had. But the emotional machinery built to sell that progress didn't treat cleanliness as a right newly restored to everyone equally. It treated cleanliness as a competition with an entry fee, and it aimed its sharpest anxiety at exactly the people least able to pay that fee in full. The state had rationed washing by income for 141 years. The advertising industry that replaced it kept the same ranking, income at the top, dirt at the bottom, and simply stopped admitting that money was the variable doing the sorting. You can see the whole arc of this story in a single unbroken thread running from 1712 to 1901. First, a parliament that taxed manufacture itself, stationing officers inside factories and locking the pans at night, because it wanted the revenue more than it wanted a clean population. Then, when the money finally became less important than the mounting embarrassment of decades of lobbying, a chancellor who let the duty go in a single budget line after 141 years. And then, almost immediately, a new set of hands picking up the exact same lever the state had just put down. The fear of being judged, publicly, as unwashed. Barratt didn't need excise officers or locked pans. He had newspaper front pages, a preacher's blessing, an actress's face, and a dead moment from a painter's family turned into a slogan a nation repeated without thinking. Different tools, same target, same result. Somebody was always deciding what a British body was allowed to look and smell like, and somebody was always profiting from the answer. By the final years of the century, Pears had become something close to a household name in the truest sense. Its adverts printed not just on hoardings and in magazines, but on almanacs, calendars and trade cards that families kept and pinned up in their own kitchens, a soap company's imagery hanging on the same wall as a family photograph. That's a different order of penetration than a single clever advert. It means the moral message, the implicit question of whether you measured up, wasn't something a Victorian family encountered once and dismissed. It was something stitched into the furniture of ordinary domestic life, glanced at every single day, whether or not anyone in the house consciously registered it as persuasion at all. The scale of that reach is really the last piece of the mechanism worth naming plainly. A tax works because it is compulsory and impossible to opt out of. You either pay the triple price or you go without. An advertisement works differently, but by the 1890s, Barratt and his rivals had found a way to make it feel almost as unavoidable, simply by being printed absolutely everywhere a Victorian eye might land. You couldn't opt out of Pears any more than your grandparents could opt out of the excise man's locks. The lock had simply moved from the factory pan to the inside of your own head. It was there in the locked pans of every soapworks in Britain, sealed shut for 141 years. It was there in the £800,000 a year the Treasury refused to give up. It was there in the queue of 1,000 people outside Coventry's baths on opening day, waiting for a wash the law had made a luxury. It sold a preacher's blessing for a newspaper's front page and a painter's grandson for £2,200. It convinced a nation that being unwashed wasn't unlucky. It was shameful. Pears is still on the shelf today. So is Sunlight, folded now into one of the largest companies on earth. And so, in every advert that quietly tells you that you're not quite acceptable as you are, is Thomas Barratt. Britain spent 141 years taxing soap to keep the poor dirty, then a few decades inventing modern advertising to make everyone feel dirty anyway. Somebody, somewhere, was always going to profit from your bath. If this one surprised you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments. If the government taxed something you used every single day until the price tripled and kept doing it for 141 years, would you have noticed, or would you have just assumed that's what clean cost? And give this video a like so more people can find it.